Professor Jette Steen Knudsen from the Fletcher School. She's the Professor of International Business, is one of the world's leading lights on business and government relations, particularly from the perspective of CSR. Can you hear me? Sorry, over there. Yeah, great. It's a pleasure. I won't say how many years, but we've known each other since we were graduate students. I remember you came from MIT over to the LBS to do some of your original fieldwork in this area on business and regulation. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to UCL. She's presenting a fascinating book, which I recommend, and I've been informed it's in all good bookshops, and it's certainly on our reading list here at UCL. The talk is a book that she's written with Jeremy Moon, another colleague, another leading light in corporate social responsibility. And it's called The Visible Hand, Government Regulation and International Business Responsibility. And it's an innovative book. It's an interesting book because it looks at how governments in the first world use CSR, use multinationals and regulation over multinationals to affect change in emerging and developing economies. So I think it's a very interesting talk, really fascinating, and looking forward to it. I won't say any more. My colleagues in a moment will discuss it. So welcome. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you so much, David. And I guess I will just quickly shift to this one. Do you need to turn this off? So let's see here. So Irish asked me to talk about the future of legalization of CSR. So that's how I set it up. And I will talk about my book primarily, but I come to this question of the role of government in CSR from a number of different angles. So one is that I'm a political scientist. I'm not a lawyer, just so you know. And the other thing is that I worked for several years as director of a government-sponsored think tank in Copenhagen that was based at the time in the Ministry for Employment, and then shifted on to work for Maersk, for the CEO of Maersk, which is a large shipping and oil conglomerate. No longer oil, the oil was just demerged a few months ago. And then I came back to Copenhagen Business School. So I've had a sort of a varied background in corporate social responsibility, but I've always been really struck by this question of the role of government and the fact that CSR has traditionally been defined as voluntary initiatives. And just one little anecdote, when I was running the Copenhagen Center for Corporate Social Responsibility, we had this board of people that were appointed, as it often is with government-sponsored think tank, by various interest organizations. And the guy from the Confederation of Danish Employers, he thought this was so boring. He had to sit there because he had been told to do it. And I always had such fun with him because when he was sound asleep, I would say, well, maybe it would be good if we regulated this. And he would jump right up and say, no, CSR, it's voluntary. It has to be voluntary. Otherwise, it's just an added burden for business. So this question of government, I think, is really interesting. And I put up here a couple of articles that I've written, one co-authored with Jeremy Moon and another one that I wrote recently where you can find more information. But most of the talk today will focus on the book. So this idea that CSR has traditionally been defined as voluntary, that's really, really strong. And having recently moved, that is 4 years ago, to the United States, and having sometimes companies come to visit us at the Fletcher School, they will traditionally define CSR as voluntary. That is, social and environmental initiatives that go beyond legal compliance. But I want to look today at the role of government. Now, this is not to say that voluntary initiatives aren't important. They really are. Corporate philanthropy is huge. And on the plane over, I read an article, you may have also done it in The Economist, the most recent version, where I read that in America, almost $400 billion are given every year in philanthropy, private as well as corporate, but most of the philanthropy is corporate. So philanthropy is, of course, important. I don't want to say it's not. But government has increasingly become involved in regulating corporate social responsibility. In this country, in Denmark, in other countries in the European Union, since the 1990s, and in this country perhaps even earlier, there's been a big shift of the role of government into developing policies, social and employment policies in the beginning, that was called CSR. The focus was then very much domestic CSR, and the initiatives highlighted very much employment initiatives for people who had other problems than unemployment, and especially people who could not find a job and where the public sector trying to help people get employed had failed. So this was expensive, it was inefficient, and in many countries across the European Union, the UK, Denmark, and others, there was a big focus on corporate social responsibility defined as social and employment initiatives. And that was also how the EU began its work on corporate social responsibility, very much a focus on these traditionally domestic type of initiatives. But increasingly, governments have become involved in shaping international CSR. Here's just a couple of examples of government involvement. This is one of your 7 ministers for CSR. There's a new law in India that some of you may be familiar with, where 2% of profits from large companies have to be spent on corporate social responsibility initiatives. But today in this talk, I will ask 2 related questions. And the first question is, what is the role of national governments in the regulation of international CSR? I will not look at domestic, but at international CSR. And then I look at how government policies for international CSR interact with other forms of public policies. So the first question, the role of national governments in shaping international CSR. Well, recently, Jeremy Moon and I and Rineke Schlager were able to do a broad overview of corporate social responsibilities that had been undertaken by governments. We looked at 22 countries in Europe over a period of 10 years. We were fortunate to get a big grant from the European Commission. We were a member of an FP7 project. And so in this article, we published some of the findings that we had from this project. We saw that government regulation was on the rise over this 10-year period. We saw a shift from a domestic to an international focus, and we saw a shift from soft to harder forms of regulation. So that was the starting point. And this also, I think, is evidenced in the EU Commission's shift in how it has defined corporate social responsibility, traditionally voluntary beyond legal compliance, social and environmental initiatives, to this incredibly vague definition, but that by default involves government regulation, the impact of business on society. I always tell my students it's one of the vaguest definitions you'll ever come across, but it by default allows for government regulation. So in the book and in the article, we look at different forms of regulation, and we can discuss, and I hope we won't, the way that we characterize examples of these different types of policies. But we saw a beginning in this article that Jeremy Moon and Rineke Schlager and I wrote, a focus on endorsement type of policies where governments would give companies a prize, most socially responsible company, that sort of thing. A lot of political rhetoric highlighting corporate social responsibility that you can see in any kind of government's national action plan for CSR. But there's also been increasingly a number of initiatives to facilitate corporate social responsibility initiatives. So subsidies, tax subsidies, and so on have been used by many governments. And there's been a lot of partnerships as well that governments have funded and also helped create in other ways. And increasingly, mandatory policies have also become used for regulating corporate social responsibility. And one example, which is maybe a hybrid form of mandatory type of policy, are these new action plans for non-financial reporting initiatives that were adopted across a range of different European countries, and now recently has also become regulated through an EU directive. Now you do see national variation in the way that governments adopt these kind of initiatives. East European countries have been much more slow at adopting these policies, whereas the UK has been very engaged in these kind of policies, Spain, France, Denmark. So you see a lot of national variation in how governments do this. Now, in this book, since Jeremy Moon and I are both political scientists, we take issue with a particular literature. We take issue with the management scholarship on corporate social responsibility, and in particular, this idea that CSR is only voluntary. And the reason we got so into this book was because we were very annoyed with articles written by Shia and Palazzo. They are friends of ours, but they have written about political CSR, and I don't know if some of you have read some of their work. But their basic argument is that, well, with globalization, governments can no longer regulate across borders. So governments actually play a very limited role in corporate social responsibility. So instead, they argue we have a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives that are set up, like UN initiatives, a lot of these sort of soft bottom-up type collaborative initiatives. And then the thing that we really were annoyed with was this implicit argument, well, actually quite explicit in some of their work, that these initiatives are very democratic because they come from a bottom-up type approach. And they were in some ways better than governments and played an important role. And maybe there's something to this argument. We're not really going to address that. But what we found they ignored was the role of government. And this is, you see this a lot in the management scholarship. There's not much focus on CSR. Now, people like David is going probably sitting there thinking, yeah, political scientists know this, but political scientists don't often look so much at business, although there are exceptions such as you, David. But our beef, so to speak, the literature that we address, it's a management scholarship, and it's what we think is a failure to focus on government. So what we argue is, rather than look at government and CSR as dichotomous, government out here, CSR out here, we look at the interrelationship between the two. So that's where we start. So the book really is a sort of still a think piece. We're still thinking through some of the ideas from the book. We are, maybe we have started kind of backwards, because often you start with articles and then you write a book. We started with the book and now we're doing the articles. But we haven't tested it. It's sort of a think framework. So I just want to say this is not a test of our hypothesis, but just a couple of illustrative vignettes or examples of how government regulates or plays a role in shaping international CSR. And I brought up the Ethical Trading Initiative and non-financial reporting as two examples. So the Ethical Trading Initiative, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, right? Yes. I see some nods. Multi-actor partnership that focuses on labor standards or principles for sourcing of resources or products from developing countries. And member companies adopt the ETI base code that focuses on process rights such as freedom of associations and outcome rights such as safe working conditions and fair wages and so on. And it has 80 member companies. Last we looked with a combined turnover of about 166 billion British pounds. And it covers about 10 million workers worldwide. And so just to use our framework, this initiative very much came about because Claire Short, who was then Minister for International Development, was able to broker an agreement between mutually suspicious NGOs, companies, and civil society organizations, I think back in 1998. And DFID has continued to provide financial funding and also administrative resources to this initiative and has maintained an observer status on the ETI board. Now, whether there's mandatory regulation that focuses on the ETI, I'm not so sure. But at least in Norway, the ETI has pushed very much for ETI requirements being used in public procurement guidelines. And in Norway, ethical requirements have to be applied when there's a risk to human rights. There's no punishment if they don't do it. I just checked today with the Norwegian ETI, but nonetheless, it's been included in this. Non-financial reporting in Denmark, Denmark was one of the front-runner countries for this. Here you see also endorsement where the government really has promoted non-financial reporting guidelines. It has added financial support for training activities to help firms meet these guidelines, supported the UN Global Compact Network and so on, and has also and here I think there's a big discussion about the level of mandate. The first round of policy from 2008 stated that companies had to report on CSR activities if they had some, but they did not have to adopt CSR initiatives. And then later on, the focus became more specific to focus on human rights and reduce climate impacts. And now with the EU directive, companies over a certain size have to engage. So there's a shift away perhaps from softer forms of mandatory regulation, a hybrid regulation, to what some would call mandatory regulation. We just had an article in R&R with Gregory Jackson, where one reviewer kept claiming that this is command and control and not hybrid regulation. But this is perhaps a question for afterwards. So I just want to conclude the first round of the talk by saying governments really are key actors in international CSR. We see very different levels of regulation, from very soft to harder. And we see different spheres of regulation, from ethical trade and non-financial reporting. Okay, so now we're halfway through the talk. And when you give a talk like this, you're supposed to give the audience a break. And I'm supposed to tell a joke or something else that breaks the talk up. But I couldn't think of a joke. You know, 2 CSR managers walk into a bar or something like that. So I Googled CSR and jokes, and guess what came up? CSR is a joke. Just look at Volkswagen's annual report and stuff like that. So that's my joke. So, all right. So let's move then on to look at how government policies for CSR interact with other public policies, because this is something that Jeremy and Moon and I were really quite interested in exploring. So we have this framework. Let me just get a drink before I try and explain it, where we talk about public policy for CSR directly. And by this we mean government policies that are addressed to a particular CSR initiative. It could be an organization such as the ETI, or regulation such as non-financial reporting regulation, something like that. But it's a policy that's stated to focus on CSR. And the government can help initiate it. It can help fund an organization such as the ETIs by providing support for its continued operationalization. But the focus is, what do governments do to develop CSR initiatives or organizations? So the focus is on what is defined as CSR. And so we thought, well, other policies can also address the same problem, be it anti-corruption, or be it labor law, what have you. So for example, in the United States, there's a lot of the way that the US pushes for labor rights abroad is often done through trade, but they don't call it CSR. They call it trade policy. But the US trade policy will address some of the same problems that the ETI is addressing through its trade policy. We call that public policy for CSR indirectly. So in a sense, as a political scientist, I'm a little bit troubled by it, because these are sort of the traditional types of policies, be it trade policy or what have you. But they address the same problem to which the CSR policies are addressed. So we have this complicated model. One reviewer just reviewed an article by us and he said, this is really complicated. You need to explain it better. So now I've already said it in case you're going to say it. But basically what you have, I'm sorry, I'm just going to be behind you here. So we argue that sometimes governments can play an active role in the inception of a CSR initiative, such as the UK government did when it helped set up the ETI, or the Ethical Trading Initiative, or other sort of initiatives. And it can contribute to its continued operationalization. You see this arrow here. So after it's set up, continues to operationalize it. And of course, once you have set it up, you may think, something is working, something is not working. So there's an arrow going back to the government here. And then you have the regulatory context over here, where, for example, a government might adopt a trade policy or some other policy that addresses the same problem down here. And we're interested in the interactions here between policies that governments call policies for CSR and policies that are not addressed are not called CSR, but that address the same problem. So that's how we set it up. Maybe from a pedagogical perspective, this could be done better. My apologies. I hope it's somewhat clear. So let me try and give a couple of illustrative vignettes, as we call it. And one example that we focus on is tax transparency in extractives, and we also focus on ethical trade. But for now, maybe I should just focus on the tax transparency in extractive. So corruption in the extractive sector is a huge problem. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, and I know you'll talk a little bit about this in a few moments, Iris. So this is a big challenge, and so one way to address this problem of corruption in the extractive industry is through tax transparency, because the idea is that if it's made clear how much tax goes into a government, say in Nigeria, then when the Nigerian government or any other government says, well, we cannot afford to pay for schools or roads or what have you, because there's no money coming into the government, well, if you know how much money a company has paid in, you know, what the government needs to then say, well, all right, okay, fine, now we know there's this money here. It becomes a little harder to hide it. So that's the thought behind initiatives to create tax transparency in the extractive industry. So here's our little model again. Sorry, guys. So I'm just going to quickly note this initiative here, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, EITI. Again, I guess tonight Claire Short is my big hero, because she helped set this up also when she was Minister for Development, after there had been a big problem with BP that was challenged by Publish What You Pay, an NGO, for its actions in Angola. And so this Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative stated at first that companies must report on taxes paid on a country basis. So how much money is Shell paying in taxes in Nigeria, et cetera, et cetera. Other initiatives have also been set up, but they are not seen as CSR initiatives as such. And before anybody says something, there's a big discussion about this EITI initiative, because it's actually the host country government that has, once it joins the EITI, it's responsible for setting up a multi-stakeholder initiative. But it is voluntary to join. So we have characterized it as a CSR initiative. But then you have more traditional policies over here. You have the revision of the EU accounting directive that requires that extractive firms, and I think also the logging industry over a certain size, have to report on how much tax it pays in a country, both per country basis and per project basis, and that is mandatory. So companies that are registered in EU countries, have their home country in the European Union, have to do this. Now, the US, strangely enough, added this Dodd-Frank Section 1504 to the Dodd-Frank bill, which is a financial bill. It really doesn't deal with the extractive industry, as I'm sure you're aware, but nonetheless added it. Big discussion. The American Petroleum Institute doesn't want it, claims that it's, you know, creating trouble for its international competitiveness. And guess what? The new president that was elected, Donald Trump, he says, oh, this is really bad. I'm going to do away with this. So last year, he said, you know, Congress said we don't want it. Trump says he doesn't want it. So right now, it looks as if it won't stay on. But the Dodd-Frank and the EU accounting directive are very similar. And if you go and look at what the EU says about its revision of the accounting directive that allows for this provision, it says this will support the EITI very much. So there was a lot of interactions amongst these initiatives as they were developed. And the same problem, they address the same problem, tax transparency in extractive industries, but through these more voluntary, softer types of initiatives, and together with these more harder forms of law. So I think I will skip the labor issue here, and then just move to some of the contributions that we have hoped to make with this framework. And it's clearly a framework that needs a lot more development. We're still working on how we can improve it. But we think, we try at least to state that we make 3 contributions. And one is that we focus on government agency in shaping international CSR. And that was sort of the first part of the talk. And then we have this idea that direct CSR, be it the ETI, the EITI, can support indirect public policy initiatives. The EITI supporting Dodd-Frank, supporting the revision of the EU accounting directive, and vice versa. And then the indirect public policy supports the direct CSR initiative. So when there's an accounting directive that focuses on this, reducing or increasing tax transparency, then that helps, of course, the development of the EITI. So that's our main claim to fame here. Let's just see here. But I want to say 3 reflections on this, at least, and I'm sure there's many more reflections that can be added to this talk. So we have in the book focused primarily on positively reinforcing cases. And we do not claim that these are representative of what's going on. We claim that they are indicative of possibility, but we do not claim that they're representative. Because we came to this research project sort of from our article from the research project that I talked about, where we noticed that it's more international governments is involved. So we started kind of backwards. But we want to highlight that although governments have become increasingly active in regulating this, we have primarily looked at policies where there's a big element of discretion. So, for example, in non-financial reporting in the European Union, large companies, they have to now submit a report, and there are certain areas that they have to submit on, like human rights. But how they do it is not determined. There are different ways you can do it. So you can do this in different ways. So there is discretion in how you do it. And then we came up with, and none of us are really good musicians, but we thought, well, maybe these policy interactions are a little more perhaps like jazz. And we borrowed this from Mary Jo Hatch, an article that she wrote in AMR, American Management Review, where she actually focuses on the inside of organizations. But we say, well, maybe the relationship between governments, both those that adopt ETI, that adopt CSI initiatives, and those in the government that are focusing on traditional types of policies, those that we call indirect CSR, and business actors and civil society organizations, maybe they take turns. Sometimes, there's one leader, like perhaps the Claire Short, when she was Minister for Development, she, took the solo and, took the lead here. Sometimes there's sort of a listening or opening up the space for others leads. These are sort of examples of jazz up here. So there's an ambiguous back and forth in policy making that perhaps this model that we try and look at reflects. So, sometimes, different actors go back and forth in terms of the roles that they play, take turns in playing different roles here. But I should maybe say also a little bit about some of the limitations of this and some of the next steps that we are looking at. So we have not explored government motivation systematically. And I think this is a really big weakness in our project because we don't really know. We have looked at some, for non-financial reporting, we have done the most work because we have looked at the various transcripts from the government, from the discussions in Parliament. And when I was running the Copenhagen Center, I was basically a part of the policy making. So we know some, but this could be done a lot more systematically than we have done. I also think that when we come back to this, we want to study more systematically the kind of policy learning that takes place. And I think you can do this much more in a much more detailed manner. How do you learn about what works and what doesn't work? How do these different actors get together? And in this, one of the articles that I listed up front, I compared policy making in the United States with policy making in the UK. And there you see that policy learning is very different. In the US, there's much more of a collaborative, in the UK, sorry, there's much more of a collaborative approach. You bring in civil society organizations, you talk about how can we make a joint solution. It's not that you don't do that in the States, but you are not as likely to do it. And in the United States, if you compare the US with the UK in terms of companies' willingness to join multi-stakeholder initiatives, you see a much greater interest in the UK in doing this. A lot of companies in the US are worried about joining multi-stakeholder initiatives. And one example of this is perhaps some of you may be familiar with the Accord, this initiative that was set up after the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh in 2013, where more than 1,100 workers died and 2,500 workers were wounded. The European firms set up an initiative that had union representation and that was legally binding. And the US firms, at least the large firms such as Gap and Walmart, were very worried, and they said, we're not going to do that. We will set up a business-led initiative, that was the Alliance, that is not legally binding and that doesn't have a union involvement. And interestingly, actually, there has been 2 cases now with the Accord where suppliers to Accord members in Bangladesh have not lived up to the requirements of the Accord. They focus on building security. And the union representation, international union representation of the Accord, have taken them to the arbitration court in The Hague, and actually have, in 2 cases, companies have had to pay the suppliers money to actually get the factories up to speed, and also some money back into the unions so that they can build more capacity in Bangladesh, help the unions get stronger, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that reflects very much different policy traditions that you then see, I'm sure, reflected in different types of policy learning and in different forms of CSR initiatives that you see. Now, we have looked at positive examples. We haven't looked at relationships between direct and indirect policies that are contradictory or hostile. Although perhaps the recent Trump sort of dishing of the Section 1505 may reflect an example of hostile relations between the European Union and the United States, and also reflects power and sometimes power imbalances in these sort of initiatives. And so the last thing we haven't looked at, and then we won't look at, but this is something that I think really deserves to be looked at. So if some of you are looking for a good research project, what are the outcomes of some of these initiatives? Do they actually make the world a better place? And I think that that's the note I want to end on. And thank you very much for listening.